everybody here today. We're going to be in Micah, book of Micah, chapter 2, if you want to turn over there here this morning. And if you didn't get a handout on your way in and you would like one, we'll make sure you have one. Just raise your hand, and Brother Dustin will get you one on your way in, down in the front. Anybody else? I feel like I'm a little hot up here, Sterl. I noticed that at the end of the service. The monitors just turned up a little bit. Good to see everybody here. We're looking forward to getting into this book. Micah is a very rich book, and it's a lot more positive. Not that any message in the Bible is negative, but sometimes it isn't, because it speaks to us, and we're not super positive all the time. But Micah's got a lot more positivity woven throughout it, but it's definitely balanced by the failures of the people. And so Micah is a perfect representative of the prophets in the Bible. It really represents the main themes of all the prophets very, very consistently. Indictments because they've broken the covenant with God in their idolatry and their religious ritualism and in their immorality. Judgment if there's no repentance, but a promise of hope. And so he weaves all these together into this book, but he also makes sure he stops at the message of hope a lot more often. Now last week we opened up Micah chapter 1, and the book of Micah is separated into three major sections. I put them in your handout. I don't think I gave you the blanks very well last week, because for some reason I was kind of summarizing them rather than giving you the blanks. So in your handout again, there's kind of three messages that he gives. And in message 1 and 2, he talks about the nation of Israel specifically, talks to them. Chapters 3 and 4, he gives the message really that extends to the entire world and broadens it to the nations, which is an interesting aspect of the prophets that the Israelites were not expecting. God's not just concerned about us, he's also concerned about everybody else. And for some reason, after reading through all of these things, they were really under the impression that God only was really interested in their future and not the future of the Gentiles. That's why the New Testament writers had to keep drawing on the prophets and saying, they've been saying this all along. And so Micah really broadens that out in chapters 3 through 5. And then chapters 6 and 7, he kind of talks about the way in which that applies to us today. What am I supposed to do today? What shall I bring the Lord today? And who is the Lord? And how does my future hope, how does that inform the way in which I respond to God in the present? And so we're looking at the first part of this book, chapters 1 and 2. In chapter 1, which was what we visited last week, he opens up immediately talking about God's response. He doesn't give an indictment specifically outlining their sins. He jumps right to God's presence and gives kind of a picture of God's presence descending. Very similar language to God's descending on the Mount Sinai and thunder and smoke. The presence of God is supposed to invoke respect and soberness to the people. That God's accountability, that he holds us accountable for, is a big deal. And so Micah, as a response, he weeps and he mourns for the people. His reaction to God's presence in their life because of their failures and shortcomings is not to try to explain it away, but rather to recognize how big of a deal things are. And it tends to be that the one who is the most righteous takes sin the most seriously. And those who are the least righteous tend to see things as not a big deal. And Micah illustrates that in the beginning of chapter 1. Now, so we're still in his opening message. So take that into account. I wasn't going to try to do both last week because I knew I wasn't going to get anywhere close. But take into account that chapter 2 goes with chapter 1. This presence of God in the mourning because of our sin is, usually it's the other way around. These are the indictments and then we mourn. He realizes how bad things are and then he outlines what they're mourning about. So here we are in chapter 2. And we're going to go through this entire chapter. This first section is kind of broken up. We're going to read down to verse number 11 to begin, and we'll finish the last two verses at the end of the message here this morning. Well, verse 1 through 11 is kind of broken up into two sections, verse 1 through 5, verse 6 through 11. Sometimes people say 1 through 6 and 7 through 11, but it doesn't really matter. We're going to treat them interchangeably this morning for the outline, but just recognize he kind of has two people he looks at. He looks at the leaders, he looks at the prophets here. We're going to talk about both of them together. So let's read through our opening passage here this morning. Micah chapter 2, verse number 1, it says this, "Woe to them that devise iniquity and work evil upon their beds. When the morning is light, they practice it because it is in the power of their hand. They covet fields and take them by violence, and houses and take them away. So they oppress a man and his house, and even a man and his heritage. Therefore thus saith the Lord, Behold, against this family do I devise an evil, from which ye shall not remove your necks, neither shall you go haughtily, for this time is evil. In that day shall one take up a parable against you, and a lament with a doleful lamentation, and say, We be utterly spoiled. He hath changed the portion of my people. How hath he removed it from me? Turning away, he hath divided our fields. Therefore thou shalt have none that shall cast a cord by lot in the congregation of the Lord. Prophesy ye not, say they to them that prophesy. They shall not prophesy to them, that they shall not take shame. O thou that art named the house of Jacob, is the Spirit of the Lord straitened? Are these his doings? Do not my words do good to him that walketh uprightly? Even of late my people is risen up as an enemy. You pull off the robe with the garment from them that pass by securely, as men averse from war. The women of my people have ye cast out from their pleasant houses, and their children have ye taken away from my glory forever. Arise ye and depart, for this is not your rest. Because it is polluted, it shall destroy you, even with a sore destruction. If a man walking in the Spirit and falsehood do lie, saying, I shall prophesy unto thee of wine and of strong drink, he shall even be the prophet of this people. In this short passage, he really points at the leaders of the people. The reason he's bringing an indictment against the nation is because of the direction of the nation. And the direction of the nation is influenced by the leadership of the nation. And when God gives an influence to people's hands, they're to use it wisely. But one of the oldest stories is that of the corrupt leaders who take advantage of the people for their own personal gain. This is one of the oldest tales that weaves its way into most novels, to most movies, to the corrupt leader that everyone is beholden to, but is not actually there for the good of all the people. This is Jacob, who puts his women and children and all of his family before him in line when he goes to meet danger, and he's going to go to the back and meet danger last. This is the women during the famine in the books of the Kings who eat their children so that they can stay alive. This is the kings of Israel who taxed their people to poverty so that they could make political deals. This is Machiavelli, who tells his people that, hey, I'm going to create a crisis so I can be the one to solve it and retain power. This is the people in France who were the aristocracy, who had all their money while the people were dying on the streets in poverty and just eating cake at their parties while everybody else was wasting away. This is the modern day where people are willing to encourage their children to transition their gender so they get some type of moral label of being open and affirming. That's the devouring mother from earlier, willing to devour their children for their own gain. This is the Democrats protesting against DOJ's investigations to corruption of spending. The idea, I'm going to use the power I have for my own gain. And we know the corrupt leader story, and it bothers us. And so we preach against it, because here it is in Micah, and it's next, and so we talk about it. But let us not take ourselves out of the running of this applying to us, because we can use position or any kind of influence that God gives to us in our community or in our families as a way not to feed into the people we are supposed to serve, but rather to use those people to serve us. And so we're going to look at this passage and see the message that he gives. The first 2 points go together, and they're from verse 1 through 11. We're going to see the pitfalls of what a leader can fall into, and we're going to see the consequences of that. So number one is this, the pitfalls of a bad leader. The pitfalls of a bad leader. Letter A, one of the pitfalls of leadership, especially those who use it poorly, is power that corrupts to do evil. Power that corrupts to do evil. Let's look back at verse number 1 and 2. Woe to them that devise iniquity. By the way, in this whole opening section, he uses this language of devising and scheming and planning. They don't just lead and they meet things as they go. They're thinking ahead, not to be wise and to try to guard against problems that may come on with their nation or their group, but rather to figure out how to manipulate the system for their own gain. Long before, what steps can we take? Devising and scheming. They devise iniquity, they work evil upon their beds, and when in the morning is light, they practice it. There's this picture of late at night, when everyone else is sleeping, they are alive and awake, trying to figure out how to do this, and then when the light comes out, then that's where they enact their schemes. Because it is in the power of their hand, they covet fields, take them by violence, houses, and they take them away. They oppress a man in his house, even a man in his heritage. It talks about corrupt leaders, corrupt politicians. They have very elaborate, well thought out plans in order to manipulate the people's resources for their own gain. And what is the reason he gives? At the end of verse 1, because it is in the power of their hand. Why do they do it? Because they can. They do what they want. They take what they want. They take fields. This is obviously an allusion to the story of Ahab. And he's going to bring up Ahab by name specifically in this book later on. But Ahab the king, his neighbor, he's in Jezreel. He had two palaces, one in Samaria, one in Jezreel, and there's a beautiful vineyard nearby. He didn't even want it for a vineyard. He wanted it to plant vegetables, which seems like a very odd endeavor to embark on. But he wanted to plant a field of herbs, he says. And so he tries to buy the field from Naboth nearby, and Naboth says, no, it's my family's field. And that was a perfectly reasonable response. It was also the lawful response. In Israel, you're not just supposed to give away your family's heritage. It was very important that God ingrains in the law that your family's to keep your land for as long as possible. He says, this is my family's heritage, I can't give it to you. He mopes, and his wife decides to go out and take it by violence instead. Falsely accuses him, has him stoned. It's right next to his house. He says, Ahab, you can go and take it. He coveted a field, and so he took it. Why did he do it? Because he could. And he did. He got away with it. Now God saw it. The prophet comes to him and says that he's going to be judged because of it. But why did he do that? Because he had the power to do it. Power is hard because you know what you have when you have power. This reminds me of the story. This is the struggle that Frodo had, right? He was supposed to take the ring of power, the one ring that rules them all. He was supposed to carry it. It was a burden. It was a responsibility. And as you read through the story, you watch as it corrupts him, and it's a burden to carry. He becomes suspicious of everybody around him, but he has to carry all of this power on his own shoulders. Somebody who had no power himself, but now he has it all. And when the time came for him to give it away and relinquish it and go back to being a nameless hobbit in the Shire, he decides to keep it for himself. This is the tendency of power. I have it, and I will take the burden of it, but over time, I become suspicious of everybody around me. I become self-serving. And then when I should give it to somebody else, I actually just want to keep it for myself. Power has a tendency to corrupt, to do evil. Now, maybe you don't have any power. Let's ask a different question. What would you be tempted to do if you did? If you could get away with anything, what would you do with that? When something is in the power of your hand, what do you do with that? What does the Bible say in the book of Proverbs? Withhold not good to them to whom it is due when it is in the power of thine hand to do it. God gives you influence, he gives you responsibility, and he gives you authority. But he gives it to you to do good. But our fleshly tendency is to take any influence and responsibility and authority we have and use it for ourselves. Letter B. What other pitfall of leadership comes? Deception. Deception that claims all is well. I don't want to think there's a problem. I want to think everything's okay. We're going to skip down a couple verses, go to verse number 6. I said they were talking about the leaders in the first part, and we talked about the prophets in the second part, where those who are communicating truth. Verse number 6, prophesy ye not. Say they to them that prophesy, they shall not prophesy to them, that they shall not take shame. O thou that art named the house of Jacob, is the Spirit of the Lord straitened? Are these his doings? Do not my words do good to him that walks uprightly? Some have said that the message of verse number 6, that the people are preaching extends into verse number 7. They're saying, oh, see, God's going to have mercy on us, and it's all okay. Whether or not they're saying it to try to justify themselves, or the prophet is interjecting into it and saying, just so you know, God's never going to be upset with people who are doing the right things, so just do right and all will be well. Regardless, there's a central idea in this part of the passage where those who are prophesying were only trying to prophesy the things that were good to the ears of the people, lest they take shame. They don't want to have anything, they don't want to have a bad message given to them. I don't want to feel bad. I don't want to listen to that. And this is a constant tendency throughout the Bible and through the prophets themselves. In the book of Amos, remember that? Amos doesn't have a lot of narrative in it, but there's a short narrative story. Amos goes up to Bethel, and he talks to Amaziah, the high priest of the temple there at Bethel, and he says, take your message somewhere else. We don't want to hear it because you're prophesying against us. Jeremiah, this is a constant theme throughout this book. Don't tell us something that's bad about us, because that's uncomfortable. But Jeremiah says it's a lot of prophets who are preaching, and they're speaking, and they're healing the hurt of the daughter of my people slightly by saying peace, peace, when there is no peace. It's like you're not helping anybody if you make them feel good, if they shouldn't feel good. And we live in a time where there are a lot of heralds of lies. Matthew 24 tells us that false prophets are going to come. 1 Timothy 4 says that in the last days some are going to depart from the faith, speaking lies and hypocrisy. 2 Corinthians 11 says that there's false prophets who are going to come and transform themselves as angels of light, just like Satan and his messengers do. And we live in an age where heralds who are supposed to be speakers of truth often just tell you what you want to hear to get a big crowd. Speaking of Ahab, Ahab had the same issue. He was going to go to war with Jehoshaphat, and they wanted to have God's stamp of approval on this war. And I said that way on purpose. They wanted God's stamp of approval for the war they were planning on going. They didn't actually want to know what God wanted to say. They just wanted to know that God was happy with what they were already planning on doing. So they invited the prophets who would make them feel good about what they had already planned on doing. And they had already silenced opposition to such an extent that most of the prophets in the land were completely prepared to tell Ahab whatever he wanted. If Ahab didn't want to go to war, all those prophets would have said, yeah, war, bad idea. You're right, king, bad idea. Jehoshaphat says, didn't really trust any of that. He asks for another prophet. Ahab says, I hate him because he always tells me bad stuff. Apparently, he knows that there's an alternative message out there that might be given. He just doesn't even want to invite him to the party. And so Micaiah comes, and they all tell him, just tell him what he wants to hear. And what should be, I would say, one of the most famous lines in the Bible, what the Lord says, that will I speak. And Micah comes and gives him a different message. What Ahab wanted to do, he just wanted to hear what was comfortable to him. He wanted to hear what he wanted. He wanted something to be true, so that's what he invited to himself. We live in an age where we can't always trust the preachers who preach. We live in an age where we definitely can't trust the news. Right? People whose job, this is your job, your one job. You have one job. Just tell me what happened. That's all you got to do. That's the purpose. I'm supposed to turn on the TV. You're supposed to say, this happened today. And I go, okay. It's not what happens. That seems like a really basic concept to me, right? That's not what happens anymore. We turn on the news. You don't tell me what happened. Or you tell me what happened and then immediately jump to the panel. This is how you feel about this, right? I thought this was bad. It wasn't bad. It was all good. All of it was good. No, there was no problem, right? Right. There's 5 people. They all said it. And there is a tendency when we have the power to deceive ourselves into just saying, no, all is well. All is well. Letter C, greed. What is the pitfalls of a bad leader? Power that corrupts, deception that claims all is well, and greed that exploits the vulnerable. One major aspect of this passage, you can't overlook this part, is the greed and self-benefit that the leaders use. This is mostly outlined in the second half of the section we read, but if you go back to verse number 2, he mentions it there as well. They covet fields, they take them by violence. Houses, they take them away. They oppress a man in his house, even a man in his heritage. the heritage, that which is going to come after him. What they do to the family doesn't just affect them, it affects those who follow. But he really outlines this later in the next section in verse number 8. Verse number 8, even of late my people is risen up as an enemy. By the way, that's a real big indictment. These are God's people, and they are becoming enemies of their own people. What a shame that is. He gives examples. You pull off the robe with the garment from them that pass by securely as men averse from war. I'll explain that in just a second. The women of my people have you cast out from their pleasant houses. From their children have you taken away my glory forever. So he gives this one section. I brought this up in the Minor Prophets before. There was a law in the books that if you had to take somebody's coat as collateral for a deal, because that's all that they had, you were supposed to return their coat even if the deal wasn't done, because that's the man's coat he needs to sleep at night. And so there's this assumption of basic human decency that was ingrained into their law. Several times throughout the prophets, he brings up this law that you held on to their coat as a way to show that you were that unconcerned about your fellow man. And he alludes to it here. You take his garment from him. And he says this, when you pass by, look at the end of verse number 8, securely as men averse from war. It's an interesting phrase. What he means by this is either averse from war, that they hate fighting, or that they were not expecting a fight. So what is he saying here? You come by and you take advantage of somebody who doesn't want to fight with somebody or is not expecting to fight with somebody. They were kind of taken off guard. Nowadays, people who get scammed, there's scams all the time. You don't want to answer your phone if you don't know the number, because it's probably somebody from India trying to take something from you, you know. It's like, I'm from your electric company. I don't think you are, though. But they tend to target older people. And so younger people can be so proud and say, yeah, because we're smarter than them. But the reason why they target older people is because they're more trusting. They're averse from war. They don't feel like arguing with somebody, or they're not expecting to have to. And so they're taken advantage of because they weren't expecting. Like nowadays, somebody rings your doorbell and you don't know who it is. You peek out your window first. You see him. It's like, I don't know who that is, honey. Stay with the kids. Stay behind the baby gate. And then you go downstairs and you kind of like have this defensive posture, like, all right, how's this going to go? And they say, hi, I'm here to talk about your med ed bill. Are you now? And then, I just want to see your bill, see if you're paying any extra bills. I don't think so. Buddy. You're already ready for this discussion. Like, you have to win. I got to make sure I don't give away my family secrets at the door. But you shouldn't have to do that. Isn't it a shame? You're like, okay, I don't know how this is going to go. And the people who aren't doing that, they don't take that posture of defense and war, they get taken advantage of. And the reason why the scammer will leave you alone is because I'll find somebody else who's off their guard. If not, it'll be somebody else. And he says, so they deceive. Why? Because of their greed. Their greed. And he talks about vulnerable people groups in verse number 9. He says, verse number 9, the women of my people have you cast out from their pleasant houses. Probably widows. Only because, and this is not sexist, in that time period, if you had a whole family, it wasn't the woman's house, it was the man's house. He was responsible for the family. So if he takes a house from a woman, then that means there's probably not a man in the picture. Maybe he did die in war. And so she's trying to raise a family on herself. And so you have a widow takes away her house, or, he says, from children, you've taken away my glory forever. The idea of this is the things that were going to be passed on to them. So he takes advantage of the women and her vulnerability, and you take advantage of the children and their inheritance that they would have received and their vulnerability. We'll find vulnerable people groups, people who are not expecting, people who can't fight back, people who don't know how to fight back, and we'll take from them. And this is the way our world is set up. Whole governments are set up on the slave labor of children. Corrupt companies take advantage of poor people who can't retaliate. Husbands lash out their family because their wife and children are probably not strong enough to stand up to them. Power, lies, things, the pitfalls in the path of influence and leadership. So what's the result of that? Number 2, the consequences. Consequences. By the way, our fellows are coming by. If you can take your attendance slip and just drop it in, we appreciate that. just so we know who's here this morning. Good to have everybody. Consequences of a bad leader. In a very prophet-like way, he promises throughout this section poetic-like justice. For each thing that they do evil, there is an equal and opposite reaction of evil done to them. So first thing, letter A, those who do evil will have evil done to them. What's the consequences of misusing it? Eventually it comes back to get you. You always reap what you sow. Chickens always come home to roost. I don't know which saying you want to have, but it's true, whichever one you pick. Verse number 3, therefore thus saith the Lord, behold, against this people do I devise an evil. So see that the word evil, that Hebrew word ra'ah, is just bad things. You did bad things? Well, expect bad things. From which ye shall not remove your necks. This picture of slavery here. Neither shall ye go haughtily. You're not going to have any reason to be proud. For this time is evil. Verse number 4. In that day shall one take up a parable against you and lament with a doleful lamentation and say, we be utterly spoiled. The idea of this is people will write songs about you in almost a mocking, derogatory way to point out how much you've fallen. When you're bad, and there's justice because of it, people are happy about it. Now, maybe they shouldn't be. That's an aside. He's talking to the leaders. He says, people, isn't it a shame that you put yourself in a position that people are happy that you fail? No, maybe they should be more spiritual and more respectful, possibly. But we're talking about the consequences we bring on ourselves. We're looking around like, why isn't everybody sad for me? You gave that up a while ago. When we put ourselves in a position we take advantage of people, we're not going to get a lot of sympathy. He says this, he's charged the portion of my people. How hath he removed it from me? Turning away, he's divided our fields. He says earlier on, he says they've turned people out of their fields and they've turned people out of their property, so now God will turn them out of their own property that they've stolen. Verse 5, therefore thou shalt have none, thou shalt cast a cord by lot in the congregation of the Lord. This is an interesting picture. The casting a cord by lot is he's talking about where they would take a string to measure out the properties, the lot, and in order to see what belonged to who. And by the way, whenever you do that, you need two people. You hold the other end of the line. When you have a tape, hold the other end of the tape. Let's measure this out. And so these people so concerned about themselves, when it all comes back to bite them, no one else is going to go to the other end of the rope and measure out what property belongs to them. It's like they're going to look around and nobody's going to be there to help them. This is the natural consequences that we take on ourselves. When we hurt others, evil will be done back to us. There's a reaping and sowing principle. When we misuse the influence and benefits and blessings that God gives to us, then we will misuse our future as well. We can decide what we do, but we don't get to decide how it goes. When we do evil, evil is done to us. Letter B, talking about deception, those who entertain lies will live in lies. Those who entertain lies will live in lies. I want to read how this section ends, verse 11. If a man he's talking about the prophets, he talks about their consequences, he returns to this preaching of lies before he finishes off. If a man walking in the Spirit and falsehood do lie, saying, I'll prophesy unto thee of wine and of strong drink, he shall even be the prophet of this people. So he says the man's walking around in lies. And what does he preach? He preaches wealth and prosperity. Now, it's interesting that the parts of the wealth and prosperity he chooses to pull out is wine and beer. Plenty of wine for everybody. But he's lying. Why is he lying? Not because there isn't anything to drink, but because that's a mark, especially wine was always a mark of an abundance of wealth. In order to take all these grapes and to crush them down into a fancy grape drink, like it's always throughout the Bible a mark of abundance, wine and oil. And so he's going around preaching it. He happens to pull out the alcohol part of it, which is an interesting thing. And he says, but he's lying to the people. And so how does he finish this? This is a funny thing. Verse 11, he says, he shall be the prophet of this people. That's the kind of prophet you get. You get the prophet that tells you everything you want to hear, live in your flesh, even though there's a lot more things that we need to know. That's what you get. When you don't want to hear the truth, you're not going to get the truth. This is exactly the thing that comes up in Amos. Remember we talked about that? That because they had pushed away Amos and the truth, don't take your message, go home, make money there. He says that there's a famine. There's a famine in the land. Not of eating or of drinking, but of hearing of the word of God. You've pushed away truth, so your judgment is you don't have any. Micah says, you didn't want to hear the message of the real prophets, so now this is the prophet you get. Everything's fine, even though it's not. When you entertain lies, you live in lies. Going back to the news, because everything's so biased, everybody has an agenda. Nobody just tells you what happens. Then you end up gravitating only to the stories you want to know. You know, we want to say we gravitate towards places because they're the ones that are always the unbiased ones, that always give us only the truth. But our tendency is to only listen to the stories that we want to listen to, because no one's just telling us, so we'll just pick the ones that tell us the stuff that we want to know and put the spin on it that we want it to have. Because we all have a tendency to gravitate toward that which makes me feel good about where I am right now. I gave you a couple passages. Jeremiah chapter 5, the prophets prophesy falsely. The priests bear rule by their means. And my people love to have it so. We would think that there'd be a revolt against these prophets. Prophets really don't have any kind of means. They're not leaders. Prophets really only means of livelihood is the fact that people take their message seriously. But if they're speaking lies, why does everybody take them seriously? Because people want to listen to lies. My people love to have it so. They heap to themselves, 2 Timothy 4, heap to themselves teachers, having itching ears. So what does that mean? That means all that you're going to listen to is that which you want to hear. We have a tendency to surround ourselves, read, listen, and entertain only those things that already agree with us. We shame people for speaking truth into our lives. And so what happens? We put ourselves in a situation where people don't speak truth to us anymore. And so in this intense desire to feel good about ourselves, we actually have no truth coming into our life. Because I think I'm fine where I am. And God sees that as a judgment all by itself. Letter C, those who are greedy. Here's some irony. Those who are greedy will create a life not worth having. Those who are greedy will create a life not worth having. We talked about the greedy factor that causes the leaders to exploit those around them, but then what's the result? Verse number 10. He says this, arise ye and depart. Verse 10, for this is not your rest, because it is polluted. It shall destroy you, even with a sore destruction. That's funny. They took clothes from the vulnerable, houses from the women, inheritance from the children, and yet they have no rest. They have a polluted land. He says this space will destroy you. You know, people who are in politics who are so intent on exploiting those beneath them, they create a country. They create cities that they don't even want to live in. People are so intent on gaining power and money from their job that they end up ruining the environment of the place that they have to go to work. Family members are so caustic towards their own family that to live as they please, leave me alone, that they end up creating a home that they don't want to go to. You have to breathe the air of the environment you create. And a lot of us think I'm going to destroy the lives of those around me without somehow it not affecting my life, even though I have to live in it. He says, this is the land you've made. And it's not a good one. And you have to live here. So much for that. When we are greedy about and selfish and say, I'm going to do what I want in my way, we end up making a space that's not even good for us. How ironic is that? And so what is the remedy? What's the remedy of all this? It's not that we just do better, first of all, because the whole story of the Old Testament is that we don't do good at just do better. The remedy is not that we just get new leaders that are motivated by different follies than the ones of the previous generation. The remedy is Jesus. When people in Israel were in a plight because God was supposed to be their king and they decided not to have a king in Israel and do what was right in their own eyes, the nation spirals downward and downward and downward till it's not fit to live it. It's not fit to sleep in the street. It's not fit to bring your wife. That's how the story ends. It's ridiculously vile because we do what's right in our own eyes. So what's the response of the people? The response of the people should have been, let us return back to God being our king. That's not what their response was. Their response is what our response often is. We need a man to be our king that's better. So Saul will be our king. Let's have a king like everybody else. That will fix our environment, our nation, our family, our community. And of course, if you know the story at all, Saul's like the worst. He's a coward, and then he's proud. Somehow he manages to just scream by the balance in the middle. I'm gonna not show up, and then I'm gonna really show up. And there was a comfortable spot in the middle of confidence and humility where he never visited that city. He just went right by. He was the worst, and it illustrated to them that that was the wrong exit to take. Maybe you should have gone back to the first spot and say, well, we'll serve the Lord as our king. And likewise it is for us. All of us can sit in here and nod our heads vigorously at how bad leaders are because we've all experienced the bad consequences that happen when leaders are dumb. Whether it's influenced by sin or it's negatively affected by foolishness, regardless, we've had to live in the environment that they've created. And so our tendency is to say, who can fix our problems? And we look to Saul to do so. But what this passage does is gives you your first message of hope, which is this. Number 3, he gives the promise of a divine leader. The promise of a divine leader. In this last section, he gives the first message of the promise of hope. Look at verse number 13. I'm going to skip to the very last phrase. He says this, the Lord is on the head of them, the head being above them. We're going to read these passages here in just a second. But the word Lord is all capitals. This is Yahweh. This is God. He says, so what's going to be the result? You messed it up. I'm going to fix it. How? By me being your king again. Now, I'm going to get ahead of myself, but as he backtracks, this whole section, especially throughout most of the book of Micah, is about the Messiah. And the Messiah, we will find out later in the Bible, is Jesus Christ. But it's really interesting how he introduces him not just as the next king, but as the Lord, all capitals. So he gives 3 illustrations of who this better leader will be, who we know from the New Testament to be Jesus. First of all is this, letter A, he will be our shepherd. He is our shepherd. Our shepherd. So he makes you feel real hopeless about our attempts to fix our communities. And then he abruptly changes in the message to verse number 12. I will surely assemble, O Jacob, all of thee. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I will put them together as the sheep of Basra. Basra was a place where they would have sheep. It was a known field. As the flock in the midst of their fold. And this is great. I love it. They shall make a great noise by reason of the multitude of men. So he has this picture of this multitude of people. We've all been to major events where there's lots and lots of people. You know, you go to the farm show up in Harrisburg, you can get a parking spot, and there's all this commotion, right? There's this picture of all the commotion. And the commotion is this multitude of people all being led by somebody like a shepherd leads a flock of sheep. And he says, I will assemble you. He's like, you tired of your bad leaders? Are you tired of that? Every time you complain about politics, remember, if I want a good leader, Christ needs to be the leader of my life. And he's ready, he is willing to guide our life. This picture is that of a shepherd who guides us to where we need to be. It wouldn't be great if we had leaders who weren't just lords over God's heritage, but were shepherds. He says, well, you're not always going to have that. But Jesus is always there for you. And this picture of Jesus showing himself that he is that great Yahweh shepherd of the Old Testament. I mean, Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, so I shall not want. But in the New Testament, Jesus says in John chapter 10, I am the great shepherd, and I give my life for the sheep. I know my sheep. They hear my voice. They follow me. He says, I will be your shepherd. Letter B, he says, he will be our deliverer. Our deliverer. Look at verse 13. He is our deliverer. This is a very interesting phrase he uses in verse 13. The breaker is come up before them. They have broken up and passed through the gate and are gone out by it. This is a great picture. He calls the shepherd, he changes illustrations, he calls him a breaker. And he pictures him breaking a gate and bringing the people out. It's almost this picture of people being bound in prisons or held hostage in a city. And he comes up and he breaks the wall so that they can be free. I love that. No list in any systematic theology of names of Jesus Christ is going to include this one, but I think we should add into it the breaker. Put him in there. Because the things that hold us captive to the destructive tendencies we bring upon ourselves, he delivers. He is a freedom giver. He makes us stand before him innocent. I just preached on Wednesday, Romans chapter 3, being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. The picture of redemption is buying a slave back so they don't have to be swallowed back into the market of slavery, given freedom. And right next to setting our legal standing right, Jesus buys us back and gives us freedom. This is the picture of Hosea. This is not a foreign picture to the minor prophets, where his unfaithful wife goes away and he scrounges up enough money, takes all the money out of his pocket and takes all the barley out of his cupboards and goes and buys her back as his wife. God, if we feel like we are in bondage to the poor leadership of those around us, we can recognize not only that Jesus is our leader, but Jesus is a deliverer. And lastly, letter C, he's our king. He is our king, which flows quite naturally out of this passage. The kings have been bad, you need a new one. He is our king. Verse number 13. At the end of the chapter, at the end of the verse, it says, their king shall pass before them. He changes illustrations. The shepherd, the breaker, the king. Jesus was given to the world to lead the world. This is true for one day. You will lead one day. Unto us a child is born, the government will be upon his shoulders. His name will be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God. No matter what we do to our world, we can at least rest in this, that we'll have a good king one day over it. But he's also supposed to be our head today. Colossians chapter 1 says that he is the head of the body, the church. He said, if you're tired of people leading poorly, well then, you currently have a leader who is ready and willing to have the preeminence because he deserves it, but so that we can have a better life. When leaders fail, we must remember that at the end of the day, we are citizens of heaven, and we serve a divine king, and Jesus is everything for us that we are not. And so when we look at bad leadership, what Micah tells us is, you know what we need? We need Jesus. So he's going to bring this up. He talked about Israel. He's going to kind of shift his focus to talk about all the nations in chapters 3 through 5. And he has a lengthy section of hope in here, in this passage. So I'm excited. We're looking forward to that. We'll pick that up next week as we turn there. Well, let's pray this morning. We'll have a couple quick prayer requests before we're done, and we'll be dismissed. Father, thank you so much for your word and your willingness to lead us. And Lord, I pray that you would help all of us to to harness the disgruntled spirit of poor leadership around us into submission to your authority in our life. Every time we become discontent with how people may be correct, they've mismanaged authority. Help us not only to look and see how we've mismanaged our own, but also to look to you for the help that we need to guide and direct our lives, as you have promised to be at our head. And so, Lord, I pray that you would give all of us that wisdom to see clearly in the decisions that we make. I pray that you would be with these many prayer requests we're about to hear. In just a few moments, you'd meet those according to your will, and we pray this in your name. Amen. Okay, thank you, Brother Paul. Just very quickly, a couple quick prayer requests. Thank you for listening this morning. First of all, some of you might have gotten the Remind app. We're still working on that. We still don't really know what the issue was. I actually checked something just yesterday. I wonder if, no, it wasn't that. So, but we sent a message out yesterday about Becky's dad. We've been praying about his health. He's been struggling with his health recently. He was taken to the hospital yesterday by ambulance. He's in the ICU, and he's currently sedated and is on a ventilator. So pray for him that he would be able, the doctors would figure out what they need to do to get him back up to health. He's been a little stubborn going to the doctor, and so as men are, guys, go to the doctor. So that happens. So pray for their dad, and I know that they would appreciate that. The Burnhams are praying for their grandson Mason, has celiac disease, and so pray for him that they figure out kind of how to work into that. That's a whole other thing, whole other level above just being having a gluten intolerance. That's the right thing, right? Okay, I was like, I'm going to talk about something completely wrong. So pray for them as they figure that out. That gets really sticky, especially in our world now. So pray for them that they figure that out. My wife is praying specifically for her dad. He was in and out of the hospital recently with some stomach issues that they were having, and so they're figuring that out, trying to figure out exactly what they need to do for him. And so pray for my father-in-law, and then also Sam's uncle is recovering from cardiac arrest over in the Philippines, right? Yeah, cardiac arrest from the Philippines, and so pray that they figure out exactly what they need to for him, and we would appreciate that. The Flowers are praying for Leah Seacrest, which is their daughter. The nerves in her back have deteriorated severely, and doctors have made an urgent referral to a surgeon. So pray for the Flowers family member, Leah, that they should figure out exactly what they need to do for that. The Mannings are praying for Russell Manning, Pat's brother, who's having some heart problems and is on full oxygen. So pray for them. He's been on the prayer list off and on a lot. He's been having some health needs. And so pray for Pat's brother, Russell. And then lastly, a couple things. Kathy Smith is praying for the salvation of their family. A lot of folks have unsaved loved ones in here, so keep praying for one another there. And then lastly, Brother Shellerman's asking us to continue to pray for Ukraine, for their friends in the occupied territory, for Israel. Hopefully those conflicts come to an end here soon. We'll pray to that end. Let's bring these to the Lord in prayer. A lot of health needs this morning, and we'll ask for God's hand of blessing on our next time. Father, thank you for answers to prayer recently. A lot of folks have been getting better from recent sicknesses, but still a lot of folks who have been out. A lot of pretty major medical needs this morning from family and friends. My father-in-law, of course, being in and out of the hospital recently with stomach pains, and Sam's uncle recovering from cardiac arrest over in the Philippines. I pray that you would give them the grace and strength that they need in both of those situations. We do pray for the Burnham's grandson, Mason, as they're figuring out how to move forward with his celiac disease. I pray that you would give them wisdom in order to navigate that well. We do pray for Becky's dad in the hospital. Pray that you give the doctors the wisdom to make the right decisions there, and that her dad would be able to get back up on his feet. And we know that your will be done there, but Lord, we pray that you would help him to navigate his health well, so that he can be there for his family. We do pray for Pat's brother Russell with all of his consistent medical needs, having some heart issues right now and is on full oxygen. I pray that you would help them to know what they need to do for him to stay healthy. We do pray for those who have family members who are not saved. I pray that you would help all of us to be lights to our community and to give the gospel to those who are nearest to us. I pray specifically for Kathy Smith, praying for her family's salvation, that you would give her wisdom and be a good influence for you in their lives. And we finally pray for our world and for those who are making sacrifices to go around the world and to serve, but we do pray for our leaders that would make wise decisions in many of these major conflicts, that you would bring them to a swift end of peace very soon. And so, Lord, we put that into your hands as well. We do pray for the second service as we meet once again, or that you give Brother Bain the words to say to those who are here for that you would help us to be yielded to your word. We put the time into your hands, and we ask it in your name. Amen. Well, thank you all for listening. We'll see you here in just a few minutes. If you were here for the first service, we'll see you a little bit later tonight.